Should we start? Yes. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session on the road to good governance. And we are, as you are aware, discussing this theme in the context of the overall thrust of this conference, societies in transition. I'm the moderator of this session. I have the privilege. My name is Surendra Munshi. I'm a sociologist, and I come from India. And I will be introducing, though they don't need any introductions, the panel that we have. But I would still like to mention briefly, I'll introduce the panel to you. But before I do that, let me introduce the theme that we are going to discuss. I will restrict myself to very, very brief comments because I'm sure, like me, all of you are wanting to hear the panelists. But let me kindly make a few brief comments. The road to good governance, I think in this respect, we must realize that democracy is not just elections, though they are important, but democratic institutions matter, and these democratic institutions are meant for common good in order to serve the common good as far as democracy is concerned. And these stable, responsible institutions which get created then promise that democratic agenda is fulfilled. So it's not just random elections or a sporadic election, but the follow-up by way of democratic institutions, as we have seen with respect to newer democracies or the frustration of democracy after it has been introduced. And in this panel, we are interested in hearing our panelists talk in terms of what is meant by good governance, how to measure it, what are the key elements of good governance, risks attached to this, and what is the road to good governance? Is it possible to have good governance without democracy? So this is, by and large, the thrust of this session and the poser to our distinguished panelists. And please allow me very briefly to make my own short input on this. Good governance is a normative concept, in the sense that when I say a good player or a good singer, I am making a normative statement. I do not use good player unless I say a player who plays well. Similarly, good governance, in the domain of governance, it is good if it qualifies certain normative standards. The reason why I mention is that World Bank and other international agencies have tried to define good governance as if it was a descriptive term, and I've had a lot of trouble in thinking of good governance as a descriptive term. I think there is a very clear normative issue involved. Good means good in its domain. The second point that I would like to make is that good governance is not just a modern concept. Good governance has been there in pre-modern, pre-democratic societies as well. And I'm sure, I don't want to go into details, all of us have from our own respective histories governance under kings, governance under different forms of society where good governance prevailed, or standards of good governance were tried to be. And from Indian history, I can give multiple examples. But I wouldn't do that. I would make my third point quickly, namely, good governance that we discuss these days is necessarily within a democratic context. I don't think we talk these days of good governance in terms of kingship. We talk in terms of democratic context. And once we do that, I think then the problem starts in this literature because we behave like proverbial 7 blind men in Indian folklore who went to see an elephant. One of them touched the trunk, one of them touched the stomach, one of them touched the leg or the tail, and came up with different descriptions of an elephant. But I think good governance we have to keep in mind includes multiple dimensions like principles, like purpose, like a manner of functioning and so on. And I would very briefly, and that's a submission. I have myself written on this subject and offered the following definition, which is slightly longer, but incorporates these multiple dimensions in some ways. Good governance signifies a participative manner of governing that functions in a responsible, accountable, and transparent manner based on the principles of efficiency, legitimacy, and consensus for the purpose of promoting the rights of individual citizens and the public interest that indicates the existence of political will for ensuring the material welfare of society and sustainable development with social justice. I've tried to incorporate these multiple dimensions which go into defining good governance. Now, absence of good governance does not necessarily mean inefficiency, and that's my last point that I wish to make. I think we often make the mistake of thinking if there is no good governance, there is inefficiency. And my own experiences, and I've tried to work in this area for quite some time now, actually the absence of good governance may be a sign of tremendous efficiency. The reason why I say it, bad governance may be good business for those who stand to gain by it. There are agencies in the world, as we all know, who would try to impose bad governance in terms of accountability, transparency, and so on, because it is to their benefit. So I think we need to keep that also in mind, namely vested interests operate not necessarily with inefficiency. Actually, very often, vested interests operate with tremendous efficiency in suppressing good governance, and we need to take that into account. With these brief comments, it's my tremendous privilege to talk about our panel. We are very privileged, all of you and myself, to have an exceptionally distinguished panel with us. We have now Aung San Suu Kyi, who doesn't need any introduction at all, the leader of National League for Democracy in Myanmar, Nobel Peace Laureate 91, and in her peculiar case, because of her biographical reasons with which we are familiar, the acceptance speech was delivered only in 2012. I would very strongly recommend, if you haven't heard that speech, the video, an extremely moving speech indeed. She's the winner of multiple other awards, and she is in Forum 2000, member of International Advisory Board of this organization, a personal friend of Václav Havel, as was very clearly borne out by what she said yesterday, and more than anything else, if I may say, a symbol for democratic struggle all over the world. And then as an Indian, I have absolutely no hesitation to say that like Gandhi in his time, she bears the symbolic value of standing for justice for our time. I cannot think of any living Indian today who has a greater claim on Gandhi's legacy than you, madam. And then, of course, we have Mr. F.W., that's commonly F.W. de Klerk, former president of South Africa, and then a very close associate of Nelson Mandela. One more Nobel laureate here, Peace, 1993, but fortunately, you delivered, sir, the lecture, acceptance lecture the year you were awarded. There was no time gap. At the moment, founder of F.W. de Klerk Foundation, and also for Forum 2000, a very privileged member of Internationally Advisory Board, Forum 2000. Please welcome him. The third person, in terms of the sequence, Professor Grigory Yavlinsky, have I pronounced the name right? Professor of Economics, State University of Moscow, co-founder and former chairman of the Russian Democratic Party, Yabolko, 1993-2008, and Yabolko's official candidate for the Russian presidency. Please welcome him. Last but not least, Professor Jan Švejnar, yeah, right?
Thank you.
Director, Center on Global Economic Governance, Columbia University, Professor of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University, Economic Advisor to President Havel, Founder Director of Economics Institute of the Academy of Sciences of the Czech Republic, once again, member of Forum 2000 Program Council. You would agree with me that it's indeed extremely a privilege for you and for me to have such a very distinguished panel. We have decided among ourselves that we would invite Dasuchi to speak for about 15-20 minutes, as she likes, on challenges and perspectives of good governance in her country. Is that right? Yes. And after she has spoken, we have agreed that other moderators would come in with their comments on her presentation or their own comments of roughly 5 to 6 minutes. Thereafter, with this round, I propose to invite our panelists to interact with themselves on critical issues, which I would like to highlight, or they may themselves bring up. And then I would greatly hope there would be time for an interaction between you and the panel, because I'm sure the panelists would enjoy it, and believe me, so would I. Now, may I, with these few words, please invite Dasuchi to give her presentation to us. Please, madam.
When I was told that the subject of this discussion would be good governance, the first thing I wondered was, why good governance rather than good government? Is that because good government is a contradiction in terms? Or is it because it's something that we cannot really define? But why good governance? How is it different from government? So I looked up the word govern in the dictionary, and the etymology is to steer, to direct. And that gave me an idea of what I would like to see as good governance. Good governance would then mean good steering, good steersmen and women at the helm of a country. To steer is not the same as to direct or control. To steer is to carry your country, your society with you. And good governance would mean to steer it in the best direction possible. In my country, we may not know what good governance is, but we certainly have known for many years what bad one is, what a bad governance means. A bad governance means that the people in general are not stepping together, are not moving forward together with those who are in control of their political destiny. Bad governance would mean a government that is apart from the people, a government that cannot fulfill the aspirations of the people and does not perhaps even realize that the people do have aspirations and have the right to have aspirations. So, good governance for me is good steering, good steersmen and steerswomen at the helm. How do we achieve that? And why did we not achieve that in my country? When Burma became independent in 1948, we had great hopes. Our country was considered the most progressive in Southeast Asia, the country most likely to succeed. We had been through the scourge of the Second World War, and much of the country was in ruins. But in spite of that, within a few years, we established ourselves as the country most likely to succeed. We had an excellent education system, a good health system. We had a democratically elected government. I won't claim that our democracy was perfect, but then I think very few countries can claim that these days, that they enjoy a perfect democracy. But our people had rights. We felt free. We felt secure. We felt proud. I was lucky to grow up at a time when I thought that our country was one of the best in the world. In fact, I grew up thinking that everybody spoke English and Burmese because these were the two most important languages in the world. And I thought that the whole history of the world was a struggle between the English and the Burmese, and we won in the end. That is how I saw it. But this feeling of confidence was shared by many of our people. And I think that is one of the ways in which you can recognize good governance. How much confidence do the people have in their country? How much confidence do the people have that their country is going along the right path? How much pride do they have in their society, in what they have been able to achieve, and what they think they are capable of achieving? And I think that constitutes good governance. Good steersmen and steerswomen with whom the people feel secure, with whom the people feel safe. Secure and safe enough to speak out against these very steering parties, if they wish to. The ability to criticize, to think for themselves, because they know that they have the right to think for themselves, and that those who are steering them must listen to their voice. So for me, that is the most essential part of good governance, that the people feel they are in safe hands, not strong hands, not the kind of hands that will never let go of their grip, but the kind of safe hands that will take them to where they would wish to go to, and that would be prepared to let go once they want to be let go. The most effective leaders are those who are prepared to let go and who know how to let go gracefully. Nothing becomes a leader as well as the way in which he or she leaves his position. That will decide how good a steersman or steerswoman he or she was. So when we look at a country like Burma, we have seen that bad governance means leaders who do not wish to let go, who have no confidence in the people, who do not respect the people. For years and years, we were told that our people were not fit for democracy. Yet, we had become independent as a democratic nation. We became independent under a democratic constitution, and our people chose our own government. In spite of the experience of those early years, it was very usual for the military regime under which Burma lived for half a century to say that our people were not fit for democracy. If the leaders say that a people are not fit to decide for themselves what their destiny should be, that means very simply that we are not enjoying good governance. We are not led by those who believe in us. And people and those who do not believe in the people cannot be good steersmen, good steerswomen. They cannot constitute good governance. Good governance is mutual. It means that the people have to be involved, that there is a mutual acceptance of the need to cooperate. It's not just those at the top imposing their views, their values, their ideas on those under them, as they would see it. A steersman, one thinks of as somebody in a boat, a ship. He may be there in the position to direct the vessel, but he is not on top of everybody else. He cannot be removed from the rest, because in the end, the direction in which the vessel goes will depend very much on how willing the others in the vessel are to follow in the same boat, to stay in the same boat, to be prepared to be in the same boat. If the time comes when the people of a country feel that they cannot be safe in the same boat as those who are leading them, then we can be sure that good governance does not exist. So confidence, for me, is what is most important. Mutual confidence. The confidence of the leaders in the people, the confidence of the people in the leaders. Each learning from one another and each giving to one another. And there we come to the second part of good governance. How much giving is there? How much giving on the part of those who are governing, and how much taking? Mr. Munshi mentioned that bad governance could mean very, very great efficiency, because some people are getting a lot. So it's not about getting, it's about giving. What is good governance capable of giving the people? And what are the people prepared to give for good governance, to give towards good governance? I'm a great believer in a sense of duty, which may not seem very fashionable these days, but even in my country, where we're just starting out trying to democratize, I always say that is as important as democratic rights are democratic responsibilities. Unless we are prepared to shoulder our responsibilities, we cannot call ourselves Democrats. If we think we have no responsibilities, that means that the government alone has the right to all the responsibilities and therefore to all the decisions. So that's not democratic. So how much are the people prepared to give? That will decide how good the governance of a country is. How much the people are prepared to give, just as much as how much the government is prepared to give. How much freedom it is prepared to give. How much security it is capable of giving. For me, that is what democracy is about, a healthy balance between security and freedom. Because we have suffered for decades under authoritarian rule, where the leaders have insisted that we have to give up certain liberties in the name of security. And that I cannot accept. Security and freedom can exist in the right healthy balance, provided there is mutual confidence between those who are leading and those who have to be led, or who are prepared to be led. They must agree to be led by those who are at the helm. We are starting out on the road to democratization. There are many of you who may think we are already along the road to democratization in Burma, but I would not agree with that. We are just starting out, and it is going to be a difficult road. I hope not a very long one, but certainly not an easy one. We have had half a century of military rule, and the same people who were part of the military regime constitute the great majority of the present government. So I think that alone is enough to tell us that we still have much to do. We want to establish good governance in our country. But before I came here, I spoke to just very ordinary people I met on the street. What do you understand by good governance? By the way, you can't actually translate good governance in a way that is different from government in Burmese. So I simply said, what would you think? What would you call a good government? For you, what is a good government? And the answers were very simple. They said, we want a government that would care for us. And for us, that is what good government is. A government that cares for us, that understands our needs. And then somebody else reminded me that I had often described what a good government was. Now this, I believe, comes from an old Eastern saying, I'm not quite sure whether it's Chinese. Some say it's Chinese, some say it's not Chinese, but I read it somewhere, and I have used it in my political speeches, and people have remembered it. Apparently, there are 4 kinds of government. So we'll start with the worst kind, the one right at the bottom. And apparently, this is the kind of government that the people despise and detest. That is at the lowest of the low. And then a step above that is the kind of government that people fear. So that is rather better than one that is detested and despised. But then you get up higher, and then you get to the kind of government that people praise. But that's not the best form of government. Right at the top is a kind of government that people do not even know exists. And so I spoke about this in my political speeches, and I said, this is what we want to have in this country. We want a government that is self-effacing, but so aware of its duties and so able to discharge them fully that the people do not even know that it is there, that it's been done for them. So I compared it to a good mother who you wake up in the morning and you sit down to breakfast and you never think of how the breakfast has got onto the table. It's just there for you to have. You don't have to think of the fact that your mother probably got up 2 hours before you did and had to light the kitchen fire and then had to get the pots and pans together and cook this and cook that and lay the table. But all you know is that when it's time for you to have breakfast before you go to work or to school, there it is, ready on the table. You're not aware, hardly aware of how this was done. So I suppose this is what is meant when you say that the best government is the kind that you never notice. And I think that's what most of us would like. And this is what one of those whom I asked just before I came here, what she understood by good government reminded me of. She said, well, you told us that there are 4 kinds of governments, and that the best is the kind you never have to notice, and that's what we want. We're sick and tired of always being aware of the fact that a government exists to control us, to make our lives a little bit more difficult, to make it impossible for us to achieve what we want to achieve. That is to say, a government that seems to many people an adversary, an enemy, rather than a friend, rather than family, rather than a really good steerswoman who would help them along the way without their being aware of it all the time. So good governance requires, as a conclusion, the ability to refrain from asking for a return. I do not think that those who ask for what they've done to be recognized can constitute good governance. This is one of the reasons why I'm always embarrassed when people talk about sacrifices made by my party or by me or by my colleagues. Because when you say that you've sacrificed something, there's always the implication that you want this recognized and perhaps you want something back in return. But I always say that we make our own choices, and because we follow a path of our own choice, we should ask for nothing back. And I think this should be part of good governance. If you want to steer your country along a certain path, along a certain road that you believe is good for all of you, you should not ask for something in return. You should not, it is not a bargain. It is not a trade-off. It is something that you must do out of conviction, out of the feeling that you who are steering the country are part of that same country, that we are all in the same boat together. Wherever we go together. What we achieve together. Good governance means that there is no real difference between those who are governing and those who are governed. The change will be there all the time. That's why it is so right that you can't have good governance without democracy. Because it's only in a democracy that there is a constant change between those who are governing and those who are governed. The head of state can, in one day, become just an ordinary citizen if he decides to retire, or if the citizens decide that they no longer want to support him in the elections. So good governance and democracy go together, because good governance basically requires absolute equality, ultimately, between the governing and the governed. The steersman has to be part of the rest of the passengers in the boat. He or she can't go on forever. There has to be a changeover. And always, whenever the changeover takes place, those who have let go must let go willingly, let go generously, let go with the desire to support whoever comes next. This is essential to good governance, that there should be generosity of spirit as well as confidence in one another, respect for one another. We can't have good governance unless those who are governing respect those who are governed, and vice versa. So for me, good governance is very simple. It's, in the end, based not so much perhaps on politics as on human relations. And if you can establish the right kind of human relations in your society, then I think you are on the way to good governance. But if your society is such that there is no culture of mutual respect and mutual confidence, then I think we'll have to work very hard towards good governance. Good governments, I will leave to others to define, but I find it very difficult to think of what a good government might be. I think the less government, the better, in the sense that the less obvious the government makes its presence felt, the better. And my people seem to agree with this, because they very readily support the idea of the best government as one which they need never notice. Thank you.
Thank you. Very briefly, I picked up one expression. She said, we make our own choices. And earlier she had said and defined good governance in terms of people feeling they are in safe hands. That brings to my mind when the people of Myanmar make their own choice in the near future, and the right choice, we know very well they will be in the safest possible hands. Now with this, I would request F.W. de Klerk to kindly come in with his comment, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I have the highest appreciation for the contribution of Aung San Suu Kyi to define what good governance is. I agree with her whole approach, and I don't want to add to it or try to qualify it in any way whatsoever. As I listened to her, I thought she's telling us what good governance is, and thought of our title, which also says, The Road to Good Governance. We all live in an imperfect world, tested against the guidelines set out by Aung San Suu Kyi. How many good governments, in how many countries do we have good governance in this world? We live in an imperfect world. So I will approach it a little bit from a totally different angle. And that is to ask what factors can help in a country, what factors can help to ensure that this ideal of good governance is realized. I don't want to criticize you, Mr. Moderator, but you left out that I'm also the founder member of another foundation, the Global Leadership Foundation.
Absolutely.
Why I mention it
Absolutely.
is the mission of this foundation is to promote good governance throughout the world. And what we do is we have 34 former presidents, prime ministers, cabinet ministers, senior diplomats, all of them with good experience of governance, all having learned lessons from burning their fingers, making their own mistakes. Fortunately, all with good reputations. And what we do is to give quiet, discreet advice to governments on how they can improve their quality of governance. So for me, it's an issue lying very near to the heart. I think that to ensure good governance, one has to have institutions and rules in place, taking account of human nature. A leader might be a good person reaching out to the people, having the right approach when he or she becomes leader, but can become corrupted. Often does. Can become overly ambitious. Can, as you have said, not know when it is the time to go, when it is time to let go. So, to ensure good governance, I believe in democracies we need to have measures in place, rules, constitutions, which can assure that the misuse of power can be prevented. When we negotiated our constitution, we were afraid of the tyranny of the majority, because there is a tyranny of majority in many countries throughout this world. And therefore we set out, and fortunately on the other side of the table was Nelson Mandela, who understood our position as we tried to understand their position. And we negotiated a constitution. I'm not saying it's the only model, which provides for checks and balances. Firstly, it does not give absolute power of an elected party and government. It has values, basic values, which may not be changed in any way by normal legislation. The Constitution is the highest law in the land. There's a constitutional court. If government in its executive decisions, or if parliament in its legislative procedures does anything which is unconstitutional, anybody can take that to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court has the power to even scrap legislation and say this is not allowed. Why? In order to uphold the basic values which formed part of the accord which we reached when we drew up that constitution. Part of the factors which one needs in a country to help ensure good governance is to have proper separation of powers between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Independent courts, an independent prosecuting authority, which will not hesitate to prosecute a president or a minister when that president or minister makes him or herself guilty of corruption. We've negotiated that into our constitution. Inclusivity, I think, is very important. More and more countries are becoming more and more diverse and multicultural and multi-ethnic. In about 200 of the countries of the world at the moment, there are important minorities consisting of 10 or more % of the population. The rules should make provision that those minorities who may never gain power will be accommodated in a way where they will feel that their concerns legitimate concerns are being listened to, where they will feel that although a minority and not part of the majority, they are accepted and cherished as important building blocks of the greater whole. Because the management of diversity is one of the greatest challenges of our time. I would say the threat of majoritarianism and the threat of suppression of minorities goes hand in hand next to the problem of 1/3 of the world population living in absolute poverty constitutes the three biggest challenges for this century in which we find ourselves. Good governance, I fully agree, demands inclusivity. It demands a form of constant consultation and interaction. Governments shouldn't lock themselves up in ivory towers. They should have their fingers on the pulse of the people. They should understand the needs of the people. And quite correctly, they should serve the people. They are not elected to govern. They are elected to serve. Then, if they do that, there will be that support from the electorate, this confidence which Aung San Suu Kyi so importantly raised as a crucial factor. Good governance, in the end, can only be achieved if there are controls and checks and balances, and if not too much power is centered into any one person or any one party's hands. Therefore, yes, it goes hand in hand with democracy. There are good examples, as you've said, of good governance in undemocratic states. But then good governance depends on the fact, is the ruler a benevolent ruler? But even benevolent rulers can become corrupted, and sometimes benevolent rulers did become corrupt, and there was no mechanism to remove them and to replace them with another leader. I believe that bad governance is responsible for much pain, much of the suffering which is experienced in so many parts of the world. And therefore, the promotion of good governance lies at the heart of curing the ills and the stresses and strains of the present international community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. An extremely complimentary presentation highlighting music to a sociologist's ears, the need for institutions for protecting and promoting good governance. Thank you indeed. And with these words, I would now invite Professor Yavlinsky to make your presentation, please.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be on the panel with such kind of speakers. That's why I want simply to follow and to develop what was said just before. I want to tell you that I think that good governance depends on all of us very much. Without us, good governance simply not possible. We are responsible for good governance in our countries. You can't have a good governance simply as granted. What are the preconditions of the good governance? From my point of view, main preconditions for the good governance is a strong public control, which would lead that government and governance to real transparency. Under the good governance, what means implementing decision implementing. I have no doubts that that means not so much leaders, even if you have wonderful leaders, but institutions. And that's also rely on us and depends on us. If we as the people are creating really procedures and institutions in politics, in economics, this is the task for the nation, if nation really wants to have a good governance. Decision-making, it's very much depends on the leaders which we have, but it's, from my point of view, we can have a very clear criteria what means a leader for a good governance. Besides all the other qualities, it must be the person which have vision. I'm afraid that very often at the modern world we forget about that. We forget that the main quality for good governance is vision, and I would add, which is based on truth, which is not very often you can find at the moment. And certainly in every century you can find the criteria. What means a good governance in different centuries? There were such periods of time in mankind history when good governance was the enlightened monarchy, and the people were very happy about the enlightened monarchs. But I think in the 21st century, any kind of debate or discussion about the good governance without real genuine democracy is simply senseless. That's why I want to underline that the criteria for the 21st century of the good governance is the human dignity and human freedom. More freedom, better governance. More human dignity in the country, better governance. And that is comparatively easy to understand because the 21st century is the century of creativity. That means that this is a century of the free people, and the respect to the people and the respect to their dignity is maybe the main feature in the 21st century of the good governance. And once again, it very much depends on how we are taking part in the elections, what kind of a choice we are doing, how politically active we are, how active we are in creating in our countries good governance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. And you have turned the focus the other way around now. Not just the leaders, but what we are doing. Very welcome focus, because we are very often blaming or praising our leaders, forgetting our own responsibilities for good or for bad. With these words, Professor Švejnar, if I may request you, please.
Thank you very much. So much has been said. I agree with a lot of it. I would start with, I think that Aung San Suu Kyi, you've given us I would say, optimistic, a healthy optimistic view, both today and yesterday. And I think that's what really is needed for achieving good governance. You really need the kind of positive approach that you're stressing. I agree that the steering is really the right way to look at it, and the lighter it can be, the better, provided the circumstances permit. I agree with Willem de Klerk that the legal framework, the institutional system, is really crucial. If you look at what's been happening in the societies in transition in the former Soviet bloc, I would say if there is one Achilles heel, it's been the inadequate attention paid to establishing a well-functioning legal system from which everything then goes. I would add that leadership, which has been mentioned a few times, is a necessary ingredient. And the way I look at it, really, at this point in the world, we do suffer from a lack of leadership. There's more leadership among the panelists here on my left than actually among many leaders in countries right now. So I think that's a necessary condition which has to be there and which very often is not. The world is also very important in the sense that it has become much more complex. So the external factors are playing a part that could be, to a large extent, ignored by many countries in the past and cannot be now. So in some sense, an essential ingredient of good governance is having leaders, having government that is light-footed, as you said, but at the same time has the skills, has the knowledge, has the global understanding. Because countries, especially small countries, but large ones as well, can be exposed to huge external shocks. We've seen it with the financial crisis and the subsequent recession and so on and so forth. So in that sense, there is a duty of the leaders and good governance to protect people, right? Protect people who are vulnerable. And we have a system that, in fact, lends itself to these kinds of shocks. The other thing, amidst all the positive approach, and I share the enthusiasm and optimism, I think one has to realize that things sometimes work and sometimes they don't. It was very interesting when you mentioned how after 1948, Burma was indeed a very promising country. I remember in the courses on economic development, we look at where countries were and where they ended up. And indeed, in the early 1950s, countries like Burma, Yugoslavia, Israel, Republic of Korea, Tanzania were seen as countries which several decades later would be among the most developed in many respects, not just the economic one. And some have made it, and others have been, for a variety of reasons, taken astray. So I think that as we are charting the course, the road to good governance, these factors have to be taken into account. Internal factors you've mentioned, and the political gridlock often prevents even leaders who have the skills, have the good intentions in enacting the system of governance that would take the country there. I recall shortly after the fall of the Milosevic regime, I was invited by the deputy prime minister in charge of the economy in Serbia to come and visit, discuss the situation. And it was very enthusiastic as a situation because they said, look, we can learn from the 10 years of transition in the other countries. We have a terrific advantage. We have people who studied in the West are coming back, right? And it was an internal political gridlock, really, which prevented Serbia from realizing the high aspirations that were there. So I think that it's important to be enthusiastic, important to be positive, but at the same time, I think cautious optimism is important there as well. And I think the one thing to realize is that the transition to good governance, democracy, and well-functioning economy, which is what people in the end expect in terms of improvement of their welfare, is something which is not like a weed that spreads and really takes over easily. It is more like a fragile flower that you have to handle with care and really pay attention all the time. And so the art of governance is to a large extent resting in that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. Yet another dimension, if you like, the focus on transition. We are not just talking about good governance in vacuum, but we are talking in terms of transition, let's say, from bad to good. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you will agree that the noblest possible ideas have been expressed by our panelists, and I would like to provoke them in order to stimulate a discussion, not a meaningless provocation, but a provocation bearing out of hard realities of our life. And I would like to, please bear with me, if I bring down the discussion from lofty ideals to a bit of ground reality and see how we can relate these ideals that our panelists have projected before us. And I think all of them agree, by and large, with the kind of definition of good governance that Da Suu Kyi initially presented, with some emphasis here and there, with difference. But I think the definition of good governance is not at discussion, so to speak. But what, to my mind, is a good deal at discussion is the issue of leadership and people. I think that's a very major issue at stake, and I would formulate the problem in the following manner. Namely, if the leaders are like Da Suu Kyi, the people are in safe hands. But, unfortunately, political leaders, also in exalted democracies, are more and more less of taking more of taking and less of giving, more of perversion of political party apparatus, and more of populism, which makes, in certain sense, a mockery of democracy. Now, the question is, how do we make sure that within democratic societies, leaders are the leaders who deserve to be leaders, who come into the forefront, and if they don't, how do we help prevent the abuse of power in the hands of power brokers? We already have heard Mr. de Klerk saying, create institutions, create checks and balances, but we also know that with checks and balances, what happens in the expression of an Indian who was asked which of the two parties he was going to vote, he said, both are worse. What happens when we are faced with a situation that both are worse and I still have to exercise my voting right? I would turn this question to Daswachi and say, what happens if politicians are less giving and more taking? Within democratic apparatus, how do you visualize the kind of leadership which should be there? How do we ensure that?
I think it depends a great deal on the people. In a democracy, if they are free to choose their leaders, why would they choose those who are more intent on taking than giving? Of course, it could be because they're taken in by a veneer of generosity, by a veneer of caring. But I think there, what we need is more information, more transparency. I agree absolutely with Mr. de Klerk, the need for good institutions. And I have to mention something which is very crucial to our country, a good constitution. We need good constitutional safeguards against bad leaders. I would like to put it that simply, because when my party decided to re-enter, if you like, legal politics last year and contested the by-elections, the three main planks of our election platform were rule of law, an end to ethnic conflict, and amendments to the Constitution. Now, rule of law means that we control bad leaders through the establishment of just laws and through an independent judiciary. And the reason why we put emphasis on rule of law is linked to amendments to the Constitution. The Constitution is such that the judiciary is totally under the domination of the executive. How can we control bad leaders if the judiciary is not independent of the executive? So that was one of the reasons why we linked our first plank to the second two. The second one was end to ethnic conflict. If we are to have peace in our country, we must be sure that our people feel that they have access to justice. Without the conviction that they will be dealt with justly, we will not be able to bring about peace between our different ethnic communities. And again, that comes back to amendments to the Constitution. We do not have a democratic Constitution. Let me say this very clearly. This is why I was a little surprised when you said, you implied that I was optimistic. I've always advocated cautious optimism, much to the annoyance of many who want to believe that Burma is safe on the way to democratic transition. And I keep saying, no, let's be cautiously optimistic. With a constitution as we have, there is no guarantee of a safe way to genuine democracy. This constitution is not democratic. It does not provide for an independent judiciary. It does not provide us with enough control over what Mr. Munshi would define as bad leaders. And it does not ensure that the people have the right to choose the kind of government they want. There are many things wrong with this constitution. I won't go into this in detail because I may not come to a stop, and then Mr. Munshi will have to do this to me. He said that this is what he will do to any of the panelists who go on and on talking.
Thank you. But I would turn this around, Professor Yavlinsky. What if we, the people, don't rise to the occasion. We are familiar with the expression, you get what you deserve.
I want to make one observation. In my country, we have a wonderful constitution.
Do you?
We have an absolutely wonderful constitution with divisions of powers, with human rights, with whatever. And we have nothing of that in reality, simply zero. We have a disgusting governance with a wonderful constitution.
Do you have a wonderful judiciary?
In the constitution, yes.
No, I mean,
In the constitution, yes. But in reality, we have all together, we have business together with power, business and power together with the judiciary power, business and authorities we have all together with the executives, all this we have together with the parliament, and all this we have everything in one package, and means that we have no normal life. We have a kind of a Soviet system with a new face, you know the name of the face. That's it. So, so I want simply to underline that the Constitution is very important, but I know very democratic, really, countries without Constitution, like Great Britain, for example, and just they have more or less democracy. And we have a Constitution, but we have no democracy. That's why I'm saying, if people are not prepared to fight for control and transparency of the government, if people are not fighting for implementing their own laws and constitutions, no good government's possible. No. So this is a task for us. The government itself don't want to have a good governance. They don't want. This is the good people are in the government or bad people are in the government. They don't want. Only under pressure and control from the public, through different ways, through media, through elections, through trade unions, through political parties, through demonstrations from youth organization, women organization, dogs organization, whatever organization. If all of them are pressing on the government, then you have a chance to have a good government.
Fine.
In my country, one person controlled 200 people in the government. Only one person. No way. No way.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And now I would turn to, this is the time to turn to now, Mr. de Klerk. Is a good constitution enough?
A good constitution which you ensure is a living document is good enough. If a good constitution remains words on paper, it doesn't offer any guarantee whatsoever. So the question is, why in Russia and other countries with good constitutions are the constitutions allowed to be mere words on paper? Which brings me to institutions. We can't leave politics only to the politicians. I want to bring into our discussion the need for a vibrant and a dynamic civil society, who, when the politicians fail or where opposition is too weak to a party with too big a majority, where civil society steps into the breach, stand up for principles, stand up for values, find ways and means to create pressure and to make an impact, even to draw international pressure or whatever. In the end, in a democracy, a constitutional democracy or a non-constitutional one like Great Britain, it's in the hands of the voters to use the system. For that reason, we've also discovered it in our work in the Global Leadership Foundation. Electoral systems need to be watched very carefully. It quite often happens that elections are stolen by people in government. It happened twice in Zimbabwe. And I've just had a discussion with a leading person from an opposition party in a Latin American country, where it is alleged the election was stolen. So good electoral systems, as independent as the court should be, is fundamentally important to give assurance to the electorate that their will be done after each and every election. You also asked about, we cannot make good leaders. I think a part of the 21st century's problem is, with all the technological developments we've had, is that we are falling into the trap of reactive leadership. Leaders tend, with all the polls which are now so easily taken, to look at the polls, to try and give the people what they hear through polls, what they want, instead of having and showing vision, as you said. The task of a leader is to have a vision, to develop action plans to achieve that vision, and to convince the majority of the population, even if for the moment they want something else, to say, no, support this.
Right.
This will improve the situation in our
Because
country.
it's true.
And there's a culture of reactivism in too many of our political systems instead of creative leadership. Now, I think the world needs more creative, forward-thinking leadership.
Thank you. Thank you. Did I see a slight shift in your emphasis from constitution to quality of leadership, or was I imagining?
No, there's not a shift. It goes hand in hand. If you get a bad leader or a bad government, constitutional safeguards are fundamentally important.
Yes.
Working mechanisms, not mechanisms on paper, but mechanisms which are used. Aung San Suu Kyi said, people should feel that they have access to justice. That is fundamentally important. Therefore, how courts are appointed is very important in such a constitution.
Thank you.
To prevent from the beginning in a good constitution manipulation of the judiciary by those in political power, separation of power.
Thank you. Thank you indeed for this clarification. And I would like to now turn to you with your emphasis on transition, making it slightly broader now than what you chose to give to the term transition. How do we make the transition from one form of society to the other, one type of governance, bad, to good governance? And how do you make the transition from bad leadership to good leadership? Wow. Passive audience, public, to more active public. These are the points which have come up. So how do we handle this complex transition?
Well, if we knew the answer, I think many countries would be better off, but let me try. So I think that what's often underestimated is how important the first generation of leaders is. Because you start with a revolution, be it here in the Czech Republic or somewhere else, you have people on your side, okay? You really have enthusiasm, people are willing to sacrifice, they're willing to give, as you said, the leaders are there, and so on. If you have a few successful years, months, whatever you define as the period that's relevant, it's like an upward spiral. Okay, it's mutually reinforcing, and if the international community responds, as it usually does in the first phase, with assistance, be it technical, be it financial, and so on, you actually have a shot at making, or at least achieving, the first stage. If you miss that, if you really lose the faith, belief, loyalty of people, if people start feeling that you're not there to provide service, as you say, but rather to self-enrich in whichever way yourself as leader, I think you start losing people's allegiance, and it's a downward spiral. And it's very difficult to go from the downward to the upward. It's, in technical terms, you have two equilibria, the good one and the bad one, two outcomes, a good outcome or a bad outcome, right? And it's very hard to go from the bad one to the new one without another kind of cataclysmic, non-continuous, disjointed thing. So that's where I think Burma and other countries that are there have their challenge, and it's a challenge for the second phase for countries like the Czech Republic and the countries in the region, especially when they are going through the shock of an international crisis, which is making everybody poor. It's very hard to do good governance, good policies when you're distributing a shrinking pie than if you're dividing things out of a growing pie, right? So that's where the real art is at that point.
Thank you indeed. Thank you. Now, I would like to pose to the panel just one more question with a hand-folded plea to keep their comments very short because we are running out of time and I would like to open the discussion to the audience. I would be glad to invite comments to this particular question from you, starting with this. The question is, it was said, the less governance, the better. That poses in itself a problem, namely, if the state is going to wither away, what happens to a country like Myanmar? What happens to a country like India, where the state needs to do a lot of cleaning and a lot of improving? So in this context, how do we visualize the role of the state? Very brief comment, if you like. Please forgive me.
You see, this would be a very brief comment on a very small question. Then my answer would be very simple. If you have a really good government of good quality, then the question, more governance, less governance, is reasonable. You can ask the government to do this and that, or you can say that we would have a very liberal government, it would not interfere at all. But when you have corrupted government, when you have a government which is not qualified enough, when you have a very corrupted elite which is not interested in any problem in your own country, it's interesting only to how to make money and just to disappear. If you have that kind of situation, then less government is better.
Fine.
They are making their own business and let the people do their own business. If you have nothing to give to the people, give them freedom. This is the formula for bad governance.
That sounds a sound principle. Less of bad and more of good. Mr. Klerk.
May I, in this regard, say I think the answer lies in striking a balance between the need for good governance and the need for governance per se, and the need for freedom of individual choice and freedom of communities to decide for themselves. When you have too much centralization of power, as you've had under the communist system and under other systems, then the individual's freedom or community's freedom are taken away. We've reached a stage where even in very democratic, successful states, they're telling you what to eat and what not to eat. Nanny states who try to fix the diet of the whole nation.
And even more.
And even more. Somehow or another, individual freedom, the freedom of choice, should not be taken away. And my definition of less government is not that government should not do the typical duties which the electorate entrusts to them, but they should not encroach into areas where really they make a mess of it.
Thank you. Thanks indeed. Thank you. Thank you.
I think when I said that a good government is one which should not be noticed, I wasn't thinking about the withering away of the state. I don't think that can happen, but there will always be a state. But I do agree that a really good government does not need to make itself felt. It should be there to serve and not to assert itself. So if we want good governance, then we want, as you've already said, a stronger civil society, which will keep it in healthy balance without having to wither away the state.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. Justice Švejnar.
Yep.
Thank you.
I would perhaps add to the discussion just two other aspects that I think are important. One is that governance at the level of individual institutions and firms, companies, etc., is important because good governance from this level then has affected the governance at the national level. And the other one is that what's more and more important is the global governance, that a lot of issues now transcend, many of them transcend the national boundaries. And the world is in a way a little bit backward because we still rely on nation states, international agreements of various sorts, and many phenomena go beyond that. And so really at this stage, the global governance ability to act beyond national boundaries is very important.
Thank you indeed, thank you. Now with this, thank you. With this we have completed 2 rounds, yes indeed. I would like to open now this to the audience, since I cannot look all of you at one glance. I would start with right, go to the center, and then go to left. I already see a hand on the right. You, please, yes, sir. And kindly, if I may request, a brief comment, if you like, or a question.
Martin Palouš. I am now president of Václav Havel Library Foundation.
We can't hear you.
My name is Martin Palouš. Can you hear me now?
The mic is not working.
A bit nearer to your mouth.
It's not working, I think.
Martin Palouš, and I'm president of Václav Havel Library Foundation. Actually, I want to follow up what Jan Švejnar said in the very end, because I was surprised that throughout your debate, I haven't heard any reference to global governance, because the word governance is mostly used in this particular context. So the question is, do you see any strong, weak, or non-existent relationship between good governance, as you have discussed it, and global governance? Just to follow up your beautiful metaphor of ship or boat. Obviously, good leader, ruler, Kybernetes, helmsman, is very much dependent not only on his relationships with his crew, but on his knowledge of the sea. And sea can sometimes be very stormy, sometimes it can be easy to steer your boat on it. So can you make a little bit, elaborate the relationship between global governance and good governance, let's say, on national level?
Thanks indeed. Who would like to respond to this?
I'll be glad to start, but go ahead.
No, please, because
Yeah.
you talked about global governance.
Yeah, so I should mention, just for the sake of full disclosure, I do work as director of the Center on Global Economic Governance at Columbia University. In fact, we are co-sponsoring this panel together with Forum 2000, because we think this is very important, that there is about 20 faculty members, including some who were at the forum here, like Joe Stiglitz and Jeff Sachs and others who are working on this alongside. And it's a big issue, because what you have is you have national governments that are making efforts. You have institutions that were created many years ago, decades ago, the Bretton Woods institutions like the World Bank, IMF, that have to quickly adjust to the reality, right? You have global players like the multinational firms that are often, determining many of the outcomes. And you have totally new players that are very important, totally out of control, like the rating and ranking agencies that will downgrade not only firms, but countries, right? They can reduce the rating. So you have actually a totally new world in which you have a lot of young professionals, many of whom are here, who are going to be the future leaders, and who have to really think of how they operate within this global world, and how do we make that governance have the desirable features that you mentioned, namely, at this point, social welfare is global, not just at the level of individual states or regions. And what you have is a situation where the interdependencies are causing a lot of side effects, spillover effects, and public goods that are of greater importance. And this is where I was perhaps too briefly referring to the fact that there is a lack of leadership at this point. And frankly, I think it's the greatest challenge that we're facing over the next several years.
Thank you. I'm still looking at right, so don't feel neglected. I'll come to you. I can take one more hand. Yes, madam.
Thank you. My name is Soon Nguyen. I'm a student, and I wonder what can political leaders do to regain people's trust if the people have such a bad experience and long experience with bad government that people probably don't even want to know about government in democracy? What can be done to ensure that the trust of the people is there? And more specifically, in Burma, what can an NLD do to gain the trust of ethnic minorities that were suppressed by the military for decades? Thank you.
You want to take it?
I think that when people no longer trust a government, it's because the government has done too much to them that they have reason to distrust them. But if you're talking about the specific issue of the ethnic nationalities and the NLD, which is a predominantly Burmese party, then it's to do with relationships between our different communities in this country. We have had a very, very sad history of distrust, and this has been aggravated by years and years of military dictatorship. So now, many of our ethnic nationalities identify the military government with the Burmese ethnic group. And what we have to make all of our people understand is that the Burmese ethnic group suffered as much as the other ethnic nationalities under military dictatorship. So we have to work together to try to establish a situation where all of us can have access to justice, where all of us can enjoy the fruits of good governance. And just because the NLD is predominantly Burmese, it does not mean that we do not have the trust and support of the ethnic nationalities. In the 1990 elections, when we were able to run in all the ethnic nationality areas, we made a very, very good showing. We were very strongly supported by the ethnic nationalities, and at this very moment, the NLD is working with a number of ethnic nationality parties to produce a joint statement on how we would wish the present constitution to be amended. So we are working together, we are cooperating together, and it is through action that we have to gain trust, not just through words.
Thank you. I'm afraid we are running short of time. We have only 5 minutes. I'll take one question. Yes, please, from the center. Yes, please. Do please try to be brief.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Martin Bursig. I'm environmentalist and politician. And looking at the countries you're coming from, I have a very theoretical question with respect to the global governance. Imagine that you are the leader of Russia, you are the leader of Africa, you represent India, you represent wider Asia and together with China, and you represent the United States. Okay. How would you handle? And you are the leaders, and you are open for cooperation. You are behind the national interests of the countries, areas you represented. How would you handle the issue of climate change? And I'm asking because International Panel on Climate Change will release a new report within 1 week. How would you handle, how would you make an agreement on this level? Thank you very much for this theoretical question.
Would anyone?
Me? Okay. My answer would be that if such a task would be necessary to solve in this group, we would start with looking for common values. And I think that we would, in that group, we can easily find them. And if we would have a common values, we would have a common language. Having common language, we can push almost every problem in the world in the right direction. Thank you.
I can just add, I think one must approach this very important subject. It might become the most important problem of our new century. One must approach it within the framework of reality, affordability, and do it step by step. I don't think one should allow this serious problem to also interfere with, let me name one other big challenge. 1/3 of the world's population are living in absolute poverty. One shouldn't allow this to attract attention away from the need to find ways and means of giving those people a decent life, of job creation, etc. The answer lies in balance. There is no absolute truth in life, and there's no just one big problem in life. The answer lies in balance and addressing the big major issues of which this is one, in balance with each other.
Thank you. One more question. One question from this side, please. The first hand I see. The lady at absolutely the last row. Yes, please. Very brief, please. We are indeed running short of time.
My name is Natalie Přibíková, and I have a problem which I very often think about. You were talking, or we all are talking, about the maintenance or about the building of proper citizens who are not afraid to raise the hand and, as you said, to be creative and not being afraid of taking not only responsibilities but have their rights and be able to formulate what you want to achieve. And I have the feeling at schools we teach many details in many sciences, but the overall awareness of our lives is not clear to the kids. That's what makes me sometimes sad. I see it with my grandchildren. It is not easy to lead the kids to being independent personalities. How can it be helped on a global scale? Thank you.
Thank you.
That side of the panel now.
Understood, frankly. You want to say something to this?
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Probably.
Okay, no, I'll take it maybe together with Martin Bursik's thing. I think that you're absolutely right that the world is changing in the sense that it's moving faster, it's requiring very quick decisions, a lot of expertise, and people cannot be the kind of individual personalities they used to be when you could be a Renaissance person, if not man, and still get away with it in the sense because there are just too many very good people running right by you, etc. Right? I think Martin's point is important because it's pointing to a long-term serious problem or potentially serious problem. We discussed a lot of things from a, if you want, short-term perspective, not negatively meant, but meant in the sense that let's get solutions. Your problem is one where there is risk, unknown, uncertainty type of things. How do we act globally when we have that? And I think that, again, to the extent that I could persuade Congress, which I cannot, I think that you want to take measures which protect you against the most extreme negative outcomes, okay, should they occur. And hopefully some of it is not going to be so expensive, some of it may be relatively expensive, but you cannot obviously allocate all the resources since you don't have them.
Thank you indeed, thank you. It's beyond my competence and indeed also beyond the time allotted to me to attempt any kind of summary. I would just pick up a few keywords that have come up very, very briefly and hurriedly. We have heard about leadership issues, the leadership that is caring, giving, responsive, responsible. We have heard about also the role that people have to play. It's not just the leaders, the people have to play. The role that, on the other hand, the institutions have to play in terms of ensuring good governance, and along with that, the management, if you like, of transition, of different kinds. I think with these words, please join me in thanking our distinguished panel for having discussed this matter as well and as thoroughly as the time allowed could allow. And thank you all for being such responsive, caring, engaging public for this panel discussion. And not to forget the translators. Was there any kind of translation involved? No.
Not to forget.
But my experience here is that Forum 2000 provides some of the best translators that one can wish for. But in this case, that was not needed. Yeah. Once again, thank you very much, and thank you all.